He never read her last message. It was the ultrasound of their daughters. 4 years later, he saw them at the airport. Julian Vance had built his reputation on control, precision, and a refusal to let anyone or anything distract him from his ambitions. Every day of his life was a carefully orchestrated performance, a balance of triumphs and acquisitions that left no room for weakness. His phone, always buzzing with messages and notifications, was an extension of that world. Every word filtered, every conversation calculated for its potential value. So when a message from Alara appeared on his screen that night, his reaction was almost automatic. He glanced at her name, felt the sharp pang of the argument they'd last had, and, without opening it, placed the phone face down on the desk next to a stack of contracts awaiting his signature. In his mind, whatever she had to say could wait, or perhaps didn't matter at all. He had convinced himself she was part of a chapter already closing, a distraction from the empire he was still building. What he didn't realize was that this wasn't just another message in a long chain of unfinished conversations. This one contained an image that could have shattered the walls he'd built around himself, a revelation of a future he had never allowed himself to imagine. Inside was the ultrasound, black and white lines forming shapes, both fragile and miraculous. Proof of the daughters he already had and was refusing to know. Alara had written only a few words with it, words meant to bridge the silence between them, words that begged him to see beyond his pride. But he never pressed the screen, never allowed himself to look. To him, the message was simply another reminder of a problem he didn't want to face, and in ignoring it, he believed he was protecting himself. Instead, in that one careless choice, he condemned himself to years of emptiness he wouldn't even recognize until it was too late. As Julian buried himself in work, moving through the endless rhythm of meetings, contracts, and late-night strategy sessions, Alara sat alone, staring at the sent notification, waiting for the tiny indicator that he had read it. The minutes stretched into hours, the hours into days, and still nothing came. Each morning she woke up hoping for a response, some sign that he had opened his heart enough to understand. But the silence that came back was louder than any words could have been. She placed her hand on her stomach, whispering to the lives growing inside her, promising them they would never feel abandoned, that they would never grow up believing they were unwanted. The absence of his response told her everything she needed to know. Julian, for his part, thought little of it. He told himself he had done the right thing by ignoring her, that he couldn't allow himself to be pulled into emotional entanglements that would weaken him. He believed an unread message was meaningless, just another discarded attempt from someone who no longer belonged in his world. He didn't notice how often his thoughts drifted back to her late at night, or how empty the silence of his penthouse seemed once the workday was over. He poured another drink, scrolled through reports, and convinced himself this was what strength looked like, moving forward without hesitation, without regret. He had no idea that the regret was already there, waiting to bloom, hidden in the words and image he had refused to see. And so, time went on. Contracts were signed, towers were built, and headlines praised the ruthless efficiency of Julian Vance. Yet, beneath it all lay the weight of that unopened message, a weight he wouldn't even feel until the day, years later, he saw with his own eyes the 3 little girls who looked at him with the same blue eyes he saw every morning in the mirror. Only then would he understand that the moment he turned his back on Alara's message, he hadn't just ignored her. He had ignored his daughters, and in doing so, he had set in motion a story far heavier than any deal he could ever make. Alara sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the glow of the phone still burning in her eyes, even though the screen had long since gone dark. She had sent the message with trembling hands, attaching the ultrasound and typing words that had cost her every ounce of courage she had left. In her heart, she had believed that once he saw it, once Julian realized there was more at stake than his empire or his reputation, something inside him would open, and the man she had once loved would re-emerge. But as the hours passed and no response came, the knot in her stomach grew deeper. She refreshed her phone again and again, staring at the little icon that never lit up, the one that would tell her the message had been read. It remained stubbornly gray, and with every passing minute of silence, she understood more clearly than ever that she was alone. The days that followed were a blur of emotion. At first, she told herself there had to be an explanation. Perhaps he was busy with meetings or traveling, or his phone had been misplaced. She clung to these excuses, but reality tore them down mercilessly. Julian never let anything slip in business. He noticed every detail, every opportunity, every threat. If he had wanted to read her message, he would have. If he had wanted to respond, he would have. That truth, simple and brutal, was impossible to deny. The man she had trusted her heart to, the man whose blue eyes once promised her security and belonging, had chosen silence. Ilara cried until her body ached, but when the tears were gone, a determination took their place. She wouldn't beg again. She wouldn't send another message into the void. Instead, she turned her energy toward survival, toward preparing for the lives that were coming. Whether Julian chose to acknowledge them or not, the doctor's words still rang in her mind. Triplets, 3 tiny heartbeats flickering on the screen like fragile lights. And while the thought terrified her, it also filled her with a resolve she had never known. She hadn't planned this, hadn't asked to be left alone. But she would rise to the challenge because she had no other choice. The months of pregnancy were the hardest of her life. Her body strained under the weight of carrying 3 children, every step heavy with exhaustion, every day a battle against fear. There were nights she woke up trembling, sure she couldn't do this on her own, sure she would collapse under the pressure. But then she would press her hand to her stomach and feel the faint flutter of movement, and the reminder of why she was fighting gave her strength. She worked as much as her body allowed, cutting back hours when the strain grew too great, relying on the kindness of neighbors in the small town she had fled to. With each passing month, Julian's silence became less like a wound and more like scar tissue, hardening her heart, teaching her to stand without leaning on anyone else. When the day came, it was chaos. The hospital room was a flurry of doctors and nurses, voices overlapping, machines beeping urgently as they brought 3 fragile lives into the world. Ilara was exhausted, her body shaking from the effort. But when the cries of her daughters filled the air, she felt her chest split open with a love so fierce it erased every doubt. Olivia, Mia, and Chloe, 3 identical girls with dark, damp hair against their foreheads and piercing blue eyes that seemed to shine even in the harsh hospital light. As she held them against her, one by one, tears streamed down her face, not of pain, but of awe. She whispered to each of them that they were wanted, that they were loved, that they would never be made to feel like a burden. Those first few years blended into a haze of sleepless nights, endless feedings, and the constant juggling of 3 small lives that needed her completely. Ilara worked when she could, slept when she could, and learned to live on pure willpower. Every smile from her daughters made the struggle worth it. Every giggle a reminder that her life still had light. There were moments of despair, moments when bills piled up or sickness struck, when the loneliness clawed at her. but she never regretted her choice. Julian's silence had forced her to discover a resilience she never knew she possessed, and while the pain of his rejection lingered, it no longer defined her. By the time the girls were 4, Ilara had created a world for them filled with laughter and stability, even if it lacked luxury. They knew bedtime stories and warm hugs, not the ache of absence. And though Ilara sometimes wondered how she would one day answer their inevitable questions about their father, she pushed those worries aside for now. She had survived his silence and had built a family without him. What she didn't know was that the man who once ignored her message would soon see his own life shattered by the sight of what he had lost, and that their paths, however separate they seemed, were destined to collide again. Julian Vance's life in those 4 years was an endless climb up the ladder of power, and yet, the higher he got, the lonelier the air became. The world looked at him and saw a man who had everything: wealth spanning continents, influence that made governments take his calls, and a reputation so formidable that rivals rarely dared to cross him. His image graced magazines. His name was whispered with admiration and envy at gala dinners, and his sharp blue eyes became a symbol of ruthless success. But when the lights went down and the applause faded, he came home each night to an apartment that echoed with emptiness, its glass walls reflecting not triumph, but isolation. He had silenced the one person who had loved him without conditions, and though he told himself he had made the right choice, the silence of his penthouse told another story. At first, Julian managed to bury any lingering thoughts of Ilara under layers of work. He convinced himself she had moved on, that whatever message she had tried to send was just another plea he was right to ignore. He signed bigger contracts, expanded his company into new markets, and sat at tables with kings and presidents. Yet sometimes, when the exhaustion weighed on his shoulders, he would find himself scrolling through old photos of her. He remembered the way her laugh used to soften the hardest days, the way her blue eyes once looked at him as if he were more than his empire. Those memories came to him like ghosts, unwanted but persistent, and no matter how many times he locked them away, they came back. The irony was not lost on him. He had told himself that walking away from Ilara meant freedom, that rejecting whatever future she carried meant he was preserving his strength. Instead, what he felt more often was the strange weight of something missing. He had built towers, but they gave him no warmth. He had surrounded himself with admirers, but none of them knew how to touch the hollowness in his chest. On the rare nights he allowed himself to wonder, he questioned if her message had been more than a demand, if he had walked away from something he might one day regret. But pride was a fortress he had built too high, and he wouldn't allow himself to lower it. It wasn't until the 4th year that the cracks began to show in that fortress. Julian was at an airport, returning from another sealed deal abroad. His thoughts centered on the speech he would give the board that night. The terminal was crowded, filled with travelers dragging luggage and children who laughed, and he moved through them with the detached stride of a man who believed himself separate from ordinary life. And then, as if fate had arranged it with cruel precision, he saw her. Ilara. Her blonde hair glowed under the fluorescent lights, and she moved with the quiet strength of someone who had weathered storms. His breath hitched, but before he could process the sight of her, his eyes fell on the 3 small figures walking beside her. 3 little girls, no older than 4, holding hands as they followed their mother. Their hair was dark, their faces almost identical, and when one of them looked up at him, Julian froze. He knew those eyes. They were his own. 3 pairs of piercing blue eyes looked at him with innocent curiosity, and in that moment, the walls of his carefully constructed life came crashing down. The unread message slammed back into his memory like a blow, and the truth he had denied for years was standing before him, undeniable and alive. They were not coincidences. They were not strangers. They were his daughters. For the first time in his adult life, Julian felt his knees go weak. The man who could negotiate billion-dollar deals with unwavering calm suddenly found himself unable to breathe. He had missed everything. Their first words, their first steps, their first few years of life, and no amount of power or wealth could ever rewind time. His chest tightened as guilt, sharp and suffocating, washed over him. He remembered every excuse he had made, every reason he had used to justify his silence, and he realized how meaningless they were now. He hadn't just ignored Alara, he had abandoned his own children. Alara's gaze found his, and the expression in her eyes was enough to cut him to the bone. There was no softness there, no warmth, only a quiet, guarded fury born of 4 years of surviving without him. She held her daughter's hands tighter, her posture protective, as if shielding them from the very man who had given them life. Julian wanted to speak, to explain, to plead, but the words were stuck in his throat. All he could do was stand there, in the middle of the busy airport, watching the family he had thrown away, walk past him as if he were nothing but a stranger. That night, long after he had returned to his sterile apartment, Julian sat alone in the darkness, his reflection in the window fractured by the city lights. The girls' faces haunted him, their hair, their eyes, the way they had clung to their mother. For the first time in years, he admitted the truth he had buried. His empire meant nothing without them. And though he didn't yet know how, he swore to himself that he wouldn't walk away again. The daughters he had refused to see had found him, and now he would do whatever it took to earn even a sliver of their trust. Julian couldn't get the image of the airport out of his mind. Every detail replayed with brutal clarity. The way Alara's hand had tightened around the 3 little ones, the protective wall she had built with her body as soon as she saw him, and the girl's piercing blue eyes that had stopped his heart with a single glance. He sat in board meetings, signed contracts, and shook hands with officials, but none of it reached him. The words blurred into meaningless sounds. The numbers became indistinguishable shapes on the page, and every room seemed colder than before. For the first time in years, Julian felt powerless, and it terrified him more than any hostile takeover or looming scandal. At night, when the silence filled his penthouse, he poured himself drink after drink, but found no solace in the burn of the expensive scotch. Instead, he stared out at the glittering skyline, remembering the way one of the girls had tilted her head, studying him with innocent curiosity. That look undid him more than Alara's fury ever could have. It wasn't judgment or hatred. It was simple, childish wonder, and yet it carried a weight that crushed him. He had once convinced himself that breaking ties with Alara was to protect his freedom, to ensure that he would never be weakened by emotional obligations. But now, standing at the precipice of this revelation, he realized that freedom had been nothing but a cage. He had locked himself inside his empire, and on the other side of the bars, 3 lives he belonged to had grown. The days after the airport encounter turned into a torment. Julian found excuses to drive by that same terminal, hoping to see them again, even though he knew it was unlikely. He instructed private investigators to find out where Alara lived, what her life had become, and within days, he had the answers neatly laid out in a folder on his desk. He looked at the photographs more than he should have, his throat tightening as he studied the life she had built without him. There was a small house with peeling paint, a modest car parked out front, and 3 girls playing in the yard, their laughter captured in frozen frames. Elara was among them, her hair pulled back in a simple bun, her face etched with fatigue, but also radiant in a way no photograph of him ever was. It hit him with cruel force that she had done it on her own, without his money, without his support, without even his acknowledgement, and had succeeded where he had failed. She had built a family. Guilt ate at him mercilessly. He remembered the last words he had said to her, the indifference with which he had dismissed her fears, the pride that had driven him to ignore her message. He had believed himself invincible then, untouchable, as if money and power put him above the responsibilities of ordinary men. Now he understood he hadn't risen above anything. He had simply fallen further, into a void that left him hollow and bitter. He had thought ambition would protect him, but it had in fact stripped him of the only thing that mattered. And what made it worse was that the damage couldn't be undone. Those girls had lived 4 years without him. They had said their first words, taken their first steps, celebrated birthdays and holidays with only their mother by their side. He had missed everything, and nothing he did could ever give it back. One night, unable to bear the silence any longer, Julian drove to the neighborhood where Elara lived. He parked down the street, his expensive car glowing awkwardly among the modest vehicles lined along the curb. From the shadows, he watched them. The girls were running in the yard, chasing each other, their voices high and musical, while Elara stood on the porch with her arms crossed, giving warnings and laughter in equal measure. Julian gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white, every muscle in his body urging him to get out, to cross the distance, and tell them who he was. But fear held him back. He had faced rooms of hostile investors without a blink. He had stared down the most ruthless competitors in his industry. But this, approaching the woman he had betrayed and the daughters he had abandoned, this made him tremble. When Elara finally ushered the girls inside, Julian remained in the car, his chest empty and aching. He realized that simply watching from a distance wouldn't be enough, that the pain in his chest wouldn't fade until he had said the truth out loud. He no longer cared about pride, about image, about what anyone might say. The only thing that mattered were those 3 little girls and the woman who had carried them alone. He whispered their names to himself, learned from the investigator's report, Olivia, Mia, and Chloe, as if repeating them could summon the courage he needed. And as he drove back to the city that night, Julian knew one thing with absolute certainty. The man who once ignored a message could no longer remain silent. He had to face the storm he had created, even if it destroyed him, because only through that storm could he hope to find a path back to the family he had never stopped needing. Julian spent days gathering the courage to approach, but when the moment finally came, it was nothing like he had rehearsed in his mind. He had imagined long speeches, carefully crafted explanations, even apologies that sounded almost noble. But when he finally stood in front of Elara again, none of those words seemed right, and all the polish of the businessman who had once commanded entire boardrooms with a single look crumbled to dust. He had called ahead, leaving a message at her door, unsure if she would even respond, and when she agreed to meet him at a quiet coffee shop in town, he was half convinced she wouldn't show up. But she did. She arrived with her hair pulled back, her face free of makeup, her eyes steady but cautious, as if every step toward him was one she already regretted. The silence between them at the table was thick, and Julian scrambled for words that wouldn't sound like excuses. Elara, however, didn't give him the chance to set the terms. She leaned forward, her voice quiet, but sharp, as she asked the question that had burned her for 4 long years. "Why didn't you read it?" For a moment, Julian couldn't breathe. His entire body went rigid, as if the weight of the past had collapsed on him in a single instant. He opened his mouth and closed it again, realizing that nothing he could say would ever erase the truth of what he had done. Still, he forced the words out. He admitted that he had been a coward, that his pride had made him believe he could simply ignore the parts of life that scared him, that he had thought pretending the problem didn't exist would make it go away. His voice broke as he confessed that he had been wrong, that not a day had gone by since the airport that he hadn't been haunted by the sight of his daughter's eyes staring back at him. Alara listened without interrupting, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. When he was finally done, she shook her head slowly. "You can't just show up now and expect me to open the door because you have regrets," she said. Her words were firm, but Julian could hear the tremor of old wounds beneath them. "I was alone at every doctor's appointment, alone in that hospital room when they were born, alone on every sleepless night, every scraped knee, every question I didn't know how to answer. You weren't there, and they don't know you exist. Do you understand what that means?" Her words wounded him more deeply than any corporate defeat, and for the first time Julian felt the full weight of the years he had lost. He tried to explain that he didn't want to erase her strength or pretend he could undo the past, but that he wanted to begin, however late, to be present in his daughter's lives. He told her he had nothing left to hide behind, that his money and power felt meaningless without them, and that he would give it all away if it meant a single chance to earn their trust. His voice cracked as he added that he wasn't asking her to forgive him for what he had done to her, because he knew some wounds could never heal, but he begged her not to punish the girls by keeping them from their father. The conversation grew heated. Alara's eyes filled with tears, not of weakness, but of rage and exhaustion. She accused him of trying to reclaim a place in a story he had abandoned, of thinking he could walk in and be a father after years of silence. Julian didn't argue. He let her anger wash over him because he knew she deserved every word. For years he had lived untouched by consequences, always a step ahead of anyone who dared to challenge him. But here, in front of Alara, he sat stripped of all defenses, exposed in a way that made him feel smaller than he had ever been. Finally, when the storm of her fury calmed, a fragile silence fell between them. Alara wiped her cheeks and said softly, "They don't even know what a father is. To them, it's just a word. If you want to change that, I'm not the one you have to convince. It's them. And you better be ready to fight for them harder than you fought for anything in your life." She rose to leave then, her hand clenching around her purse strap, and Julian knew she was giving him a rare thing, a chance, however small, to prove his worth. That night, Julian lay awake in his penthouse, staring at the ceiling as her words replayed in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt a strange clarity. His empire could crumble, his fortune could disappear, and none of it would matter, compared to the chance to be at his daughter's side. He knew the road ahead would not be quick or easy. He would have to break down walls, built with years of absence and distrust. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. For Olivia, Mia, and Chloe, he would never stop trying, even if it took him the rest of his life. Julian's first real attempt to enter his daughter's lives came on a Saturday morning, one of those crisp, early fall days when the air carried as much warmth as it did chill. Alara had reluctantly agreed to let him meet them, not in private, but in a crowded park, where the safety of distance was always available to her if things grew too heavy. He arrived early, his usual calm replaced by nervous energy, pacing near the swings like a man awaiting judgment. For once, the polished image of a CEO seemed to fall apart, his suit replaced by a simple sweater and jeans, his hair slightly disheveled, his eyes betraying the sleepless night before. He looked less like a mogul and more like a man terrified of failing at the most important meeting of his life. When Alara appeared, holding the small hands of 3 girls who looked so much alike, it was as if they had been cut from the same star. Julian almost lost his breath. Olivia, Mia, and Chloe. They wore matching jackets, their dark hair catching the sunlight, their blue eyes darting around with curiosity and laughter. They clung to their mother at first, giggling as they tried to guess who the tall man waiting for them might be. Alara crouched down and whispered something, her hand stroking their hair. And then she looked at Julian, with a gaze that held as much warning as it did surrender. She stepped aside slightly, giving him space, though her presence loomed as both a protector and a witness. Julian knelt so he wouldn't tower over them, his knees sinking into the grass, his hands trembling as he held them out with no expectations. For a moment, the girls simply studied him. One tilted her head, just as she had at the airport. Another moved behind her sister, and the third bit her lip in quiet concentration. Julian's voice cracked softly as he said, "Hi, my name is Julian, but you can call me Dad if you want." The words stuck in his throat, as if it were a foreign thing to him, yet it spilled out with a longing he couldn't contain. The girls exchanged glances, and then, with the innocence only children possessed, Olivia took a step forward. She touched his hand lightly, as if testing to see if he was real, and then whispered, "Do you like swings?" The question broke the tension. Julian laughed, a sound unpolished and raw, and replied, "I love swings. Maybe you can show me the best one here." Within minutes, all 3 were running ahead, pulling him toward the playground, their small voices filling the air. He pushed them one by one, his heart swelling with every shriek of laughter, his chest aching with the realization that he had missed years of this. Alara stood at a distance, her arms crossed, watching as her daughters accepted the man she had long hated, not with caution, but with the simple openness of children who long to be loved. As the morning stretched on, Julian learned details that pierced him with both joy and pain. He found out Mia loved to draw animals, that Chloe wanted to be a singer, and that Olivia was the one who always insisted on telling her sister's bedtime stories, even when she was tired. They talked about their favorite colors, their dislike of broccoli, and the silly games they invented together. Every revelation was a gift, but also a reminder of all he had missed. He listened intently, storing away every word like a treasure, because he knew that for once, nothing mattered more than this. When it was time for lunch, Alara spread out a blanket under a tree, and Julian sat with them, awkward at first, but slowly falling into the rhythm of their chatter. One of the girls climbed onto his lap without hesitation, clutching a sandwich as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He froze, afraid to breathe, overwhelmed by the weight of the small body against his chest. Ilara's eyes softened for the first time in years as she watched him, though her expression hardened quickly again when he met her gaze. She wouldn't forgive easily, and he didn't expect her to. But the simple fact that she had allowed this day to happen filled him with a gratitude he couldn't articulate. As the sun began to sink, Alara gathered the girls and got ready to leave. Julian's chest tightened in a panic, the fear that this fragile connection might end as quickly as it had begun. He stood up, his voice trembling as he told Alara, "Thank you for today. You don't know what this means to me." She held his gaze, her expression unreadable, and replied, "You'll have to prove it's not just for today." With that, she took the girls' hands and they waved goodbye, their laughter still lingering in the air as they disappeared down the path. Julian stayed at the park long after they were gone, sitting alone on the swing set, where their laughter still echoed. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a CEO or an industry king. He felt like a man who had been given a second chance at something he had once thrown away. And as he stared at the empty swing set, swaying gently in the breeze, he vowed that he wouldn't let this opportunity slip through his hands. If it took years of patience, humility, and persistence, he would spend every moment proving to Olivia, Mia, and Chloe that their father was not just a title, but a promise. Julian's life began to change in ways he hadn't anticipated after that day at the park. For years, he had been a man consumed by schedules, investors, and the relentless pursuit of profit. But now he found himself rearranging entire board meetings just to ensure he could make it to a school recital or a soccer practice. His assistants whispered about how unusual it was for him to cancel dinners with foreign dignitaries in favor of spending a night in a modest suburban neighborhood. Yet he no longer cared. He discovered that power no longer held the same weight it once did, because every time he stepped into that small world Ilara had built, he realized this was where life truly happened. The skyscrapers he had built seemed smaller in comparison to the joy he felt when 3 pairs of blue eyes lit up at his arrival. Still, the road was not smooth. Ilara remained guarded, often standing with her arms crossed, as if reminding him with every gesture that her trust was not a prize to be won easily. She watched him closely, testing his patience, waiting to see if his persistence was genuine or just another performance like the ones he had mastered in the corporate world. Julian did not fight her scrutiny. He accepted it, knowing he had earned every ounce of her suspicion. When she told him he could join them for dinner, but only if he brought nothing but himself, no extravagant gifts, no attempts to buy affection, he obeyed. That night, he sat at her worn wooden table eating spaghetti with his daughters, laughing when one of them spilled sauce on his shirt, and realizing that this simple, imperfect meal meant more than any banquet he had ever attended. Santiago, his trusted second-in-command at the company, also noticed the shift. "You're different," he said to Julian one morning, as they prepared for a crucial negotiation. "You used to walk into a room like it already belonged to you. Now you seem to have something to lose." Julian only smiled faintly, not bothering to deny it, because for the first time in his life he did have something to lose. 3 little girls who had become the very heartbeat of his world, and the woman whose strength both intimidated and inspired him. He worked harder than ever, not to build taller towers or bigger deals, but to ensure his daughters would never know the insecurity and absence he had imposed on them in their early years. The girls, too, began to change with his presence. At first, they treated him as a novelty, someone new to play with, but soon they began to look for him. They saved him drawings, ran to him at the park, and asked him when he would be back. One night, Olivia climbed into his lap and asked if he would read her favorite bedtime story. He looked at Ilara for permission, and though her lips were tight, she gave a slight nod. Sitting there with the book open and 3 small heads resting on him, Julian felt a rush of emotion so fierce it nearly undid him. He stumbled over the words at first, but by the time he reached the last page, his voice was steady, and when he looked up, he found Ilara watching him with a softer expression than he had seen in years. Despite these moments, the weight of his past choices hung heavily on him. One afternoon, while driving the girls home, Chloe tugged on his hand and asked with childlike honesty why he hadn't been there when they were born. The question wounded him more deeply than any accusation, because there was no answer that could make sense to a child. He melted, tears threatening, and whispered, "Because I made a mistake. The worst mistake of my life." But I promise you I'm here now, and I'm never leaving again." Chloe looked at him for a long moment before nodding and running ahead. But Julian carried the weight of that question with him, knowing it would take years to prove the truth of his promise. As the weeks passed, Ilara began to notice the small consistencies in his behavior. He showed up when he said he would. He never complained when the girls demanded his time. He learned the details of their routines, remembering which stuffed animal each one needed to fall asleep, which one disliked peas, and which one liked her hair braided differently each morning. These were things he had once dismissed as trivial, yet now they were sacred to him. Little pieces of proof that he was finally becoming the man he should have been all along. One night, as the girls slept and the house grew quiet, Julian lingered in the living room while Ilara tidied up the kitchen. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and he finally broke the silence. "I know I can't undo what I've done," he said, his voice low and serious, "but I will spend the rest of my life showing you and them that I can be better. Not the man who ignored you, not the man who thought his pride mattered more than love. I want to be their father, and I want to earn the chance to be by your side, not as a stranger, but as the man who should have been there all along." Ilara didn't answer right away. She put down the dish rag and looked him in the eye, her expression unreadable, caught between the scars of the past and the fragile hope of something new. At last, she said, "You're not forgiven. Not yet. But I see you trying, and for now, that's enough." Julian nodded, a quiet wave of relief washing over him. It wasn't redemption or absolution, but it was the first real step towards something he had believed lost forever. And as he walked out of the house that night, the sound of his daughter's soft breathing echoing in his mind, he realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't chasing a deal or a title. He was chasing the opportunity to be worthy of love, and for that, he would never stop running. Spring came quietly, and with it came a sense of renewal Julian hadn't felt in years. The sharpness of winter melted away, and as the days grew longer, he found himself welcome in more of the moments that once felt forever denied to him. Ilara still kept her emotional distance, but she no longer closed the door on him. The girls had woven him into their daily lives, and it was impossible not to notice the way their eyes lit up when they saw him, the way their laughter seemed freer when he was around. Julian clung to these moments, not with the desperation of a man trying to prove his worth overnight, but with the patient devotion of someone who understood that trust could only be built day by day. One Sunday morning, he arrived to take them all to the zoo. The girls were buzzing with excitement, tugging on his arms, pointing at the map, demanding to see the lions first, and then changing their minds to the giraffes. Julian let himself be pulled in every direction, marveling at the way they now seemed to know no boundaries with him. Ilara walked beside him, her posture still guarded, but her eyes softer than they had been before as she watched the scene unfold. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine that perhaps he wasn't just passing through, that maybe this man had finally chosen the life he once rejected. Later that day, as the girls were sprawled out in bed exhausted, Julian lingered in the kitchen with Ilara. The house was dimly lit, quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the air between them pulsed with something unsaid. He finally broke the silence, his voice raw. "I used to think being strong meant closing people out, staying in control of everything. But now I see that strength is about enduring, even when it scares you, even when it hurts. I don't want to hide anymore. I want to be here, with them, with you, if you'll let me." His words carried no demands, only the truth, and it was that honesty that made Ilara's chest tighten. She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of the man who had once walked away. Instead, she saw sincerity etched in every line, regret shadowing his eyes, and a kind of humility she had never believed possible for him. Her response was quiet, almost fragile. "I don't know if I can ever forget what happened, but I see the way they look at you, the way you look at them. I see you showing up, and maybe that's enough to start over, not as we were, but as something new." To Julian, those words were more precious than any deal he had ever signed, more valuable than the billions attached to his name. He nodded slowly, a lump in his throat, and whispered, "I'll never stop proving it." In the weeks that followed, their lives began to intertwine in ways that felt natural, even inevitable. Julian learned to braid hair with clumsy fingers until his daughters laughed and corrected his mistakes. He burned pancakes on Sunday mornings, but kept trying until the kitchen was filled with smoke and laughter. He knelt on the floor to help with puzzles, sat at tea parties with stuffed animals, and found himself captivated by the magic of their small world. With every moment, the girls grew more certain of him, and with every glance, Ilara's walls crumbled a little more. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but one evening, as the sun set in streaks of gold across the sky, Julian stood in the yard, holding Olivia in one arm, while Mia and Chloe clung to his legs, laughing uncontrollably. Ilara leaned against the porch railing, her lips curved in the faintest of smiles, and in that quietness, Julian felt something he had never known before. This was home. Not the penthouse with its sweeping views, not the boardroom with its endless victories, but here, among the laughter of 3 little girls and the constant presence of the woman he had once lost. He realized then that redemption wasn't about erasing the past, because the past would always remain. Redemption was about living differently now, about choosing every single day to be the man they needed, the man Ilara could finally begin to believe in again. And as the twilight settled over them, Julian understood that even though he had once been a stranger, even though he had walked away from the very message that could have changed his life, he had been given a second chance. This time, he wouldn't waste it. This time, he would hold on. For the first time in his life, Julian Vance, the billionaire CEO who once believed himself to be untouchable, felt truly rich. And it had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with the sound of his daughter's laughter and the fragile but growing trust in Ilara's eyes. He had finally found the only empire worth keeping, and he would spend the rest of his days protecting it.